Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when you realize someone dangerous is following you through a crowded subway station? That moment when you know your ex has crossed every line and there's nowhere left to run? If you're watching from Chicago or any major city with public transit, you know that feeling of being trapped underground with someone who wants to hurt you. Drop a comment and let me know what city you're from, because tonight's story could happen anywhere there are subway tracks and men who refuse to let go. Catalina Reyes clutched her portfolio bag tighter against her chest as she descended into the Roosevelt Red Line station, her heels clicking against the concrete steps in a rhythm that had become too familiar over the past 3 months. Always checking over her shoulder, always listening for footsteps that matched her pace, always wondering if tonight would be the night Derek finally snapped completely. At 28, she'd worked hard to build her graphic design career, landing clients that appreciated her eye for clean, modern aesthetics. Tonight's presentation had run late, the corporate executives asking for revision after revision until the sky outside their 42nd floor conference room had turned black. Now it was nearly midnight, and the platform stretched before her like a concrete tomb, fluorescent lights flickering overhead and casting sickly shadows between the pillars. The air down here always felt thick, heavy with the breath of thousands of commuters and the metallic tang of train brakes. Tonight it seemed worse, oppressive in a way that made her lungs work harder for each breath. She positioned herself near the edge of the platform where other late-night travelers clustered, seeking safety in numbers even though most of them stared at their phones with the determined blindness of people who'd learned not to see trouble coming. Her phone buzzed. Derek's number, which she'd blocked 6 times only to have him call from new numbers, new apps, new ways to slide his poison into her life. You look beautiful tonight. Red dress suits you. Did you think I wouldn't notice you working late again? Ice flooded her veins. He'd been watching. Again. The red dress was new, something she'd bought last week to celebrate landing the Morrison Industries account. She'd felt confident this morning when she'd put it on, professional and put together. Now the fabric felt like it was burning against her skin. The rumble of an approaching train vibrated through the concrete beneath her feet, and she edged closer to the other waiting passengers. Just get on the train, she told herself. Get home. Tomorrow she'd call her sister Sophia, and maybe they'd finally talk about getting that restraining order, even though Derek's father was a judge and his connections ran deep through the Chicago legal system. She almost didn't recognize his voice when it came from directly behind her. Catalina. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Derek Walsh stood 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he'd always worn, close enough to see that his usually perfect blonde hair was disheveled and his blue eyes held something wild and desperate that made her stomach clench with pure terror. He looked older than when she'd left him 8 months ago, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes and a twitchiness in his movements that suggested he'd been drinking. Or worse. The Derek she'd dated for 2 years had been controlling, manipulative, slowly isolating her from friends and family with surgical precision. This Derek looked unhinged. Hello, beautiful, he said, his voice carrying that familiar undertone of ownership that had taken her so long to recognize as dangerous. Time to come home. I'm not going anywhere with you, she managed, proud that her voice didn't shake even though her hands were trembling. The train was closer now, the rumble growing to a roar, headlight cutting through the tunnel darkness like a dragon's eye. Derek stepped closer, and she backed up until she felt the yellow safety line rough under the heel of her shoe. Behind her, the train approached with gathering speed, brakes beginning to squeal against steel tracks. You've had your fun playing independent, he said, reaching out to touch her face. She jerked back, and something ugly flickered in his expression. But you belong to me, Catalina. You always have. I've been patient, but I'm done waiting. The train was maybe 30 seconds out, slowing but still moving fast enough to kill anyone who fell onto those tracks. Other passengers pressed closer, eager to board, creating a barrier of bodies between her and the exit stairs. I don't belong to anyone, she said, and that's when Derek's fake smile finally cracked completely. Wrong answer. His hands came up fast, palms flat against her shoulders, and suddenly she was falling backward into empty air, the yellow safety line disappearing under her feet as her body pitched toward the tracks. The train's headlight blazed in her vision, horn blaring in one long, desperate scream as the conductor saw what was happening and knew there wasn't enough time or distance to stop. She had maybe 3 seconds before tons of steel and momentum turned her into nothing. Then iron-strong hands locked around her waist and hauled her forward with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. Her body slammed against something solid and warm and unmistakably male. Powerful arms crushing her against a chest that felt like it was carved from stone. The train screamed past behind her, so close that the wind from its passage whipped her dark hair across her face and sent her red dress fluttering around her legs. She was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was alive. The man holding her didn't let go immediately. She could feel the rapid rise and fall of his breathing, could feel the tension in his muscles as if he'd absorbed some of her terror and transformed it into pure protective fury. When she finally looked up, she found herself staring into the darkest brown eyes she'd ever seen, almost black in the harsh platform lighting, set in a face that could have been carved by a Renaissance master with a preference for dangerous angels. He was tall, maybe 6 foot, with olive skin and the kind of bone structure that suggested Italian heritage. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and his charcoal suit was clearly expensive, the kind of tailoring that whispered money and power. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. They burned with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul, and right now they held enough barely leashed violence to level the entire station. "Are you hurt?" His voice was deep, roughened with some emotion she couldn't identify, carrying just a trace of an accent that made her think of old-world sophistication and very new-world danger. She tried to speak and discovered her throat had closed. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving her shaky and nauseated. This stranger had saved her life, had moved faster than should have been humanly possible to pull her back from death, and now he was holding her like she was something precious that might break if he let go too quickly. She started, then stopped because Derek was still there, still within arm's reach, and she could see him calculating whether he could try again. The stranger's gaze flicked over her shoulder, and whatever Derek saw in those dark eyes made him take an involuntary step backward. "You need to leave," the man said, his voice carrying absolute authority despite its low volume. "Now." Derek's face flushed red. "Who the hell do you think you are? She's my girlfriend, and this is none of your business." Wrong on both counts. The stranger's arm tightened protectively around Catalina's waist, and she felt some of her panic finally beginning to recede. His presence radiated the kind of confidence that came from being utterly certain of your ability to handle any threat that arose. Ex-girlfriend who wants nothing to do with you, and you just tried to commit murder in front of 40 witnesses. That makes it very much my business. The train had stopped now, doors hissing open, and passengers were starting to board around them like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just been seconds away from death. The stranger guided her away from the edge of the platform, keeping himself between her and Derek, moving with the fluid grace of someone who knew how to fight and expected to win. "This isn't over," Derek snarled, but he was already backing toward the stairs, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor when faced with someone who looked like he ate men like Derek for breakfast. "Yes, it is," the stranger said simply, and there was something in his tone that made it sound less like a threat and more like a promise. Something that made Derek's face go pale under the fluorescent lights. Derek shot her one last look filled with such venom that she shrank against her rescuer's side, then turned and disappeared up the stairs into the night. The stranger waited until Derek was completely out of sight before turning his attention back to her, his expression softening slightly, though his eyes remained alert. "I'm Dante," he said. "Dante Castellano. And you're coming with me." "I don't even know you," she whispered, though her body was already leaning into his warmth, seeking the safety he seemed to represent. "No," he agreed, his thumb stroking gently across her cheek to catch a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "But you know he'll be waiting for you when you get home. You know he'll try again. And next time, I might not be here to catch you." The truth of that settled into her bones like ice. Derek had tried to kill her tonight. Actually tried to push her in front of a train. There was no coming back from that. No pretending he was just confused or heartbroken or any of the excuses she'd made for his behavior over the past months. "I can't just go with a stranger," she said. But even as she spoke the words, she knew she was going to. Because this stranger had saved her life, and Derek was out there somewhere, probably waiting. You can, Dante said quietly. Because the alternative is spending the night looking over your shoulder, wondering when he'll try again. Because your other choice is going home to an apartment he obviously knows the location of, since he knew where to find you tonight. His logic was unassailable, and more than that, something deep in her chest was responding to the way he'd said your other choice. Like her safety was already his responsibility, like protecting her was something he'd decided to do regardless of what she wanted. The train doors were closing. The platform was emptying out, and Dante Castellano was still holding her like she was something valuable he had no intention of letting go. My name is Catalina, she said finally. Catalina Reyes. Beautiful name, he said, and the way he said it made her believe he meant it. Beautiful woman. And from now on, Catalina Reyes, you're under my protection. Before she could ask what that meant exactly, he was guiding her toward the stairs with one hand resting protectively on the small of her back, his head constantly moving as he scanned for threats. She let him lead her, partly because she was still too shaken to think clearly and partly because something about the way he moved, the way he held himself, made her feel safer than she had in months. As they climbed toward street level, toward whatever came next, she caught herself thinking that maybe Derek had done her a favor tonight. Maybe he'd finally pushed her hard enough to land her exactly where she needed to be. Dante's car was exactly what she'd expected once she'd gotten a better look at him under the streetlights. A sleek black Mercedes with leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly rent, pristine interior that spoke of meticulous care and unlimited resources. He drove with the same confident control he'd shown on the platform, one hand on the wheel while the other rested casually on the gear shift, dark eyes constantly checking mirrors with the kind of hypervigilance that suggested this wasn't his first time dealing with threats. Northwestern Memorial Hospital at midnight was a fluorescent bright sanctuary that made the whole evening feel surreal. Dante had insisted despite her protests that she felt fine, and now she sat on an examination table while a tired-looking resident checked her vitals and asked gentle questions about what had happened. Physically, you're in excellent shape, Dr. Patterson said, pulling off her stethoscope. Heart rate's elevated, but that's understandable given the circumstances. Any pain in your back or shoulders from the impact? Catalina shook her head, though she was starting to feel the bruises forming where Dante's hands had gripped her waist. He'd pulled her back with enough force to stop her momentum completely, and she was grateful for every ounce of strength he'd used. I'd like to give you something mild for the shock and anxiety, Dr. Patterson continued. And I'm required to ask if you'd like to file a police report for the assault. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Catalina glanced toward the curtained area where Dante waited, his voice a low murmur as he spoke quietly on his phone. She could hear fragments of conversation, enough to know he was making arrangements for something, his tone carrying the kind of authority that suggested people jumped when he spoke. I need to think about it, she said finally. Because Derek's father was Judge Harrison Walsh and Derek himself had connections throughout Chicago's legal system. Filing a report might just make things worse. Dr. Patterson's expression suggested she'd heard that answer before and didn't like it, but she nodded and handed Catalina a small bottle of pills. Take one if you have trouble sleeping, and please consider reaching out to these resources. She pressed a pamphlet about domestic violence into Catalina's hands, the familiar gesture of medical professionals who'd seen too much. When Catalina emerged from the examination area, Dante was waiting exactly where she'd left him, phone tucked away and dark eyes immediately scanning her face for signs of distress. Everything okay? He asked, and something about the way he said it made her believe he actually cared about the answer. She's fine, Dr. Patterson said before Catalina could respond. But she's been through a significant trauma. She needs rest and a safe place to process what happened. She has both, Dante said with quiet certainty, and the doctor's eyebrows rose slightly at the possessive undertone in his voice. In the car afterward, as Dante navigated through Chicago's late-night traffic, Catalina found herself studying his profile in the dim light from the dashboard. Strong jaw, straight nose, the kind of bone structure that suggested generations of Mediterranean breeding. His hands on the steering wheel were large and elegant, with calluses that hinted at work more physical than sitting behind a desk. Tell me about Derek Walsh, he said without taking his eyes off the road. How long has this been going on? The question was casual, but something in his tone suggested the answer mattered more than simple curiosity. We dated for 2 years, she said, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. At first he was wonderful. Charming, successful, attentive. But gradually things changed. He started questioning where I went, who I talked to. He'd show up places I hadn't told him I'd be, claiming it was coincidence. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When did it escalate? After I broke up with him 8 months ago, she said, the words tumbling out faster now that she'd started. He couldn't accept it. Flowers every day, calls and texts constantly, showing up at my work. I blocked his number, and he got new phones. I changed my locks, and he somehow got copies of the new keys. Dante pulled up to a red light and turned to look at her fully, his dark eyes intense in the glow from the traffic signal. Has he ever hit you? Not exactly, she said, then caught herself because that was the kind of careful language Derek had trained her to use. He never left marks. But he'd grab my arms when he was angry, pin me against walls when I tried to leave a room. He said it wasn't violence because he wasn't punching me. The light turned green, but Dante didn't move immediately. Something dangerous flickered across his expression, something that reminded her that this elegant man in his expensive suit had moved with deadly precision when Derek threatened her. That's violence, Catalina, he said quietly. And men like Derek don't stop escalating. Tonight proved that. The truth of it settled heavily in her chest as he drove through the Gold Coast, past buildings that grew progressively more expensive until he turned into the underground garage of a glass tower that stretched 40 stories into the Chicago skyline. This is your building? She asked, staring up through the windshield at the impressive facade. One of them, he said matter-of-factly, as if owning multiple buildings in downtown Chicago was perfectly normal. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, but she could feel Dante watching her in the mirrored walls, probably cataloging her growing discomfort with each floor they climbed. When the doors opened directly into his apartment, she had to suppress a gasp. The space was massive, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. The view of Lake Michigan stretched endlessly into darkness, city lights reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. Everything was pristine, expensive, intimidating in its perfection. I can't stay here, she said immediately, backing toward the elevator as panic rose in her throat. This is too much. You don't even know me. Dante stepped between her and the elevator, his movements careful and non-threatening, but effectively blocking her retreat. You're right, he said calmly. I don't know you, but I know Derek Walsh, and I know men like him. He tried to kill you tonight, Catalina. That means he's past the point where restraining orders or police reports will help. How could you possibly know Derek? She asked, though something cold was already settling in her stomach. Chicago's not as big as people think, Dante said, which wasn't really an answer. And men who hurt women tend to have reputations in certain circles. What circles? She pressed, but he was already moving away, giving her space while somehow managing to keep himself between her and the exit. The guest room has its own bathroom and a balcony overlooking the lake, he said instead of answering. You'll have complete privacy. I have business to attend to early, so you won't see much of me during the day. Catalina wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware that she was standing in a stranger's apartment wearing a dress that Derek had seen her in, carrying nothing but her portfolio and purse. She had no clothes, no toothbrush, no idea what she was doing. I need to go home and get some things, she said, but even as she spoke, she knew it was a bad idea. Dante's expression gentled slightly. Make a list. I'll have someone collect whatever you need. You can't just send someone into my apartment, she protested. I can, he said simply, and it's safer than you going back there yourself. As if summoned by their conversation, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. Excuse me, he said, stepping into what looked like a home office and closing the door behind him. Alone in the vast living room, Catalina gravitated toward the windows, pressing her palm against the cool glass and staring down at the city spread below. She could see the red line tracks from here, snaking through downtown like silver scars. Somewhere down there, Derek was probably looking for her, trying to figure out where she'd gone. The sound of Dante's voice carried through the office door, too low for her to make out words, but carrying an edge that made her think he was not pleased with whatever he was hearing. When he emerged 10 minutes later, His expression was carefully controlled. Problem? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Derek's been to your apartment building, he said bluntly. Talked his way past the doorman. Claimed you were having a medical emergency and he needed to check on you. Building security found evidence he'd tried to pick your lock. The room tilted slightly around her. She's been gone less than 2 hours and Derek was already escalating, already trying new tactics. Mrs. Chin across the hall has a key, she said numbly. She waters my plants when I travel for work. If he hurt her to get it. Dante was already pulling out his phone again. What's her full name and apartment number? He made 2 quick calls while she gave him the information, his voice crisp and authoritative as he spoke to people who clearly took his request seriously. When he hung up, some of the tension had left his shoulders. She's fine, he said. Building security is checking on her now, and I've arranged for additional security in your building tonight. How can you just arrange things like that? She asked, though part of her was grateful he could. I have resources, he said simply, which was becoming his standard non-answer for questions she probably wasn't ready to hear the real answers to. He showed her to the guest room, which was larger than her entire apartment and furnished with the same expensive minimalism as the rest of the penthouse. The bathroom had a soaking tub that could have held 4 people, and the walk-in closet was already stocked with basics in her size. How did you know my size? She asked, fingering a soft cotton nightgown that still had tags attached. Lucky guess, he said, but his slight smile suggested it had been anything but luck. When he left her alone, she sat on the edge of the king-sized bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning, she'd woken up in her own apartment, worried about a client presentation and whether her coffee maker would survive another week. Now she was in a penthouse with a mysterious man who seemed to have unlimited resources and connections throughout the city, hiding from an ex-boyfriend who tried to push her in front of a train. She should be terrified. She should call Sophia or one of her friends, should find a hotel, or impose on someone she actually knew instead of accepting help from a stranger. But something about Dante made her feel safer than she had in months, and that feeling was almost as frightening as Derek's escalating behavior. Sleep came eventually, though it was filled with dreams of train whistles and strong hands pulling her back from darkness. She woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting through the apartment. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back with nauseating clarity. The clothes she'd fallen asleep in were wrinkled and still smelled faintly of subway platform. But the closet yielded a pair of jeans and a soft sweater in her exact size, along with undergarments that suggested Dante's resources extended to uncomfortably accurate personal shopping. She found him in the kitchen, standing over the stove in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt that somehow managed to look casual and expensive simultaneously. His hair was slightly messed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and he looked younger in the morning light, less intimidating though no less imposing. Good morning, he said without turning around, somehow knowing she was there. Sleep okay? Better than expected, she admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. It was perfect, exactly the right amount of cream and sugar even though she hadn't told him how she liked it. I took the liberty of having some of your things brought over, he said, gesturing toward a collection of suitcases near the elevator. Your neighbor Mrs. Chun was very helpful. She wanted to make sure you got your lucky coffee mug. Despite everything, Catalina found herself smiling. Mrs. Chun was a 70-year-old former librarian who'd appointed herself the building's unofficial grandmother. The fact that she'd trusted Dante enough to pack Catalina's belongings said something about his ability to inspire confidence. Thank you, she said, meaning it. For everything. I know this is an imposition. It's not, he said simply, plating bacon and eggs with efficient movements. And it's temporary, until we figure out a more permanent solution to your Derek problem. The casual way he said your Derek problem, like it was already something they were solving together, made her stomach flutter with something that wasn't entirely anxiety. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and ice immediately flooded her veins. But when she looked, it wasn't Derek. Sophia, working late again tonight. Want to grab dinner tomorrow? Haven't seen you in forever. Her sister, completely unaware that Catalina's life had been turned upside down in the space of 12 hours. Everything all right? Dante asked, noting her expression. My sister, she said. She doesn't know about last night. Keep it that way for now. he said, his tone gentle but firm. The fewer people who know where you are, the safer everyone stays. The weight of that settled over her as she ate breakfast that tasted better than anything she'd cooked for herself in months. Derek hadn't just threatened her last night. He'd threatened anyone who might try to help her, and that included Sophia, Mrs. Chun, her co-workers, her friends. But looking across the table at Dante, watching him scroll through his phone with the focused attention of someone managing multiple complicated situations simultaneously, she found herself thinking that maybe Derek had finally picked the wrong person to threaten. Maybe he'd pushed her toward exactly the kind of help she needed, even if she didn't understand yet what kind of help Dante was offering. His phone rang, and she watched his expression shift as he answered. "We have a problem," he said to whoever was on the other end, his voice carrying an edge that made her blood run cold. The problem turned out to be Derek's credit card activity, showing purchases at 3 different Chicago hotels, suggesting he was methodically searching for her. Dante relayed this information with the same calm efficiency he'd shown since pulling her from the subway tracks. But Catalina could see the tension gathering in his shoulders as he coordinated with whoever was feeding him intelligence. When he finally hung up and returned to the breakfast table, she was pushing eggs around her plate, appetite completely gone. "He's looking for me," she said. It wasn't a question. Dante sat across from her, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and protected simultaneously. "He's desperate, which makes him dangerous. But desperation also makes people careless. How do you know so much about how desperate men behave?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, born from a growing awareness that Dante wasn't just some good Samaritan with unusually extensive resources. "Experience," he said simply, reaching across to touch her hand where it rested on the table. The contact sent electricity up her arm, a reaction so immediate and unexpected that she had to concentrate on not jerking away. "What kind of experience?" she pressed, because she was tired of non-answers and vague references to business and resources. Dante's thumb stroked across her knuckles, the gesture gentle but somehow possessive. "Growing up, my family dealt with a lot of men like Derek. Men who thought they owned things that didn't belong to them." The careful phrasing wasn't lost on her. "What kind of family business involves dealing with dangerous men?" "The kind that protects people who can't protect themselves," he said, which was simultaneously an answer and not an answer at all. Before she could push further, he was standing, clearing their plates with efficient movements that suggested he was more comfortable in his kitchen than most millionaires probably were. "Tell me about Derek's control tactics," he said as he loaded the dishwasher. "I need to understand his patterns if I'm going to anticipate his next move." The change of subject felt deliberate, but something about the way he'd asked made her want to answer. Maybe it was the clinical tone that suggested he was approaching her trauma like a problem to be solved rather than a source of pity or judgment. "It started small," she said, settling back into her chair and watching him move around the kitchen with unconscious grace. "He'd ask who I was texting when my phone buzzed. He wanted to know where I was going when I left his place, said it was because he worried about me." Dante nodded without turning around, encouraging her to continue. "Then he started showing up places I'd mentioned I'd be. My gym, the coffee shop near my apartment, client meetings. Always with some excuse about why he was in the neighborhood." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, seeking warmth against the chill that talking about Derek always brought. "He started commenting on my clothes. Nothing I wore was quite right. Too revealing, too professional, too casual. He'd buy me things he said looked better, and then get hurt if I didn't wear them." She could hear her voice getting smaller as she talked, the way it always had when Derek was around. Dante turned to face her, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. His expression was carefully controlled, but she could see anger simmering underneath. "How long before he started isolating you from friends and family?" 6 months, maybe 8. He'd get quiet when I made plans without him, or he'd schedule something romantic for the same time, so I'd have to choose. He made my friends feel unwelcome when they came over. He'd interrogate me about conversations I'd had with my sister Sophia until I stopped calling her as much. The words were tumbling out now, months of careful silence breaking open like a dam. He had opinions about everything. My job was too demanding. My apartment wasn't in a safe enough neighborhood. My friends were bad influences. He said he was trying to take care of me, that he loved me too much to watch me make poor decisions. Dante's jaw had tightened with each revelation, his hands gripping the edge of the counter with enough force that his knuckles were white. And you believed him because predators like Derek are excellent at making their control feel like love, he said, his voice rough with suppressed fury. The understanding in his tone broke something loose in her chest. Yes. God, yes. I thought I was lucky that someone cared enough to worry about me. My parents died when I was 22, and Sophia was still in high school. I'd been taking care of everyone else for so long that having someone want to take care of me felt like a gift. Dante moved toward her with deliberate slowness, like she was something fragile that might bolt if startled. When he reached the table, he knelt beside her chair, bringing them to eye level. It wasn't a gift, Catalina. It was theft. He stole your autonomy piece by piece until you forgot it belonged to you. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. The gentleness of the gesture contrasted sharply with the violence she could sense coiled beneath his controlled exterior. Tell me about your family, she said, needing to shift away from Derek and toward this complicated man who'd somehow become her sanctuary. You said they dealt with dangerous men. Dante's hand stilled against her cheek, something shifting in his dark eyes. My father was in business in Chicago for 40 years. He taught me that there are wolves and sheep in this world. And if you want to protect the sheep, you have to be a stronger wolf. What kind of business? She asked, though part of her was starting to suspect the answer. Import-export, he said, which was probably technically true, but definitely not the whole truth. Dante, she said quietly, and something about the way she said his name made him look at her more closely. What aren't you telling me? He stood abruptly, putting distance between them, and she immediately missed the warmth of his touch. I'm telling you that my family has resources to keep you safe. I'm telling you that Derek Walsh has no idea who he's dealing with now. I'm telling you that as long as you're under my protection, he can't hurt you. That's not what I asked, she said, standing to face him across the kitchen island that suddenly felt like a barrier. It's what you need to know right now, he replied, but she could see the internal struggle in his expression. Before she could press him further, his phone rang from the living room where he'd left it. He moved to answer it, his voice dropping to a low murmur as he stepped onto the balcony for privacy. Catalina found herself alone in the kitchen, surrounded by evidence of Dante's wealth and refinement, trying to piece together clues about who he really was. The expensive suits, the multiple properties, the ability to arrange building security with a phone call, the way he talked about dealing with dangerous men like it was a normal part of family life. Import-export could mean anything, but combined with everything else, it painted a picture that made her stomach clench with possibilities she wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. She was still thinking when fragments of his conversation drifted through the sliding door. No, Marco. I don't care what his connections are. Touch her again, and I'll handle it personally. Yes, I know what his father does for a living. Judge Walsh can't protect his son from everything. Make sure the message is clear. She's under Castellano protection now. Castellano protection. The words hit her like ice water, because even someone who'd lived a relatively sheltered life in Chicago knew what that name meant. The Castellanos weren't just import-export. They were one of the most powerful organized crime families in the Midwest. Dante ended his call and came back inside, stopping short when he saw her face. You heard, he said. It wasn't a question. Castellano protection, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Your Mafia. The word hung between them like a physical thing. Dante's expression went carefully blank, the mask of a man who'd learned early not to reveal his thoughts to the wrong people. I'm a businessman who comes from a family that's been in Chicago for 3 generations, he said carefully. We handle problems that conventional law enforcement can't or won't address. That's a very nice way of saying you're criminals, she said, backing away until she hit the counter. We're survivors, Dante said, moving closer with predatory grace. We protect our own, and we handle threats to innocent people that the system fails to address. Derek Walsh is exactly the kind of threat my family has been dealing with for decades. Catalina's mind raced as she tried to process this revelation. The man who'd saved her life, who'd offered her protection, who made her feel safer than she had in months, was part of organized crime. Everything she'd been taught about right and wrong, legal and illegal, was colliding with the reality that this dangerous man was the only thing standing between her and Derek's escalating violence. I should leave, she said, though her body remained frozen against the counter. "Where will you go?" Dante asked, his voice gentle but implacable. "Back to your apartment that Derek knows how to access? To your sister's place, putting her in danger? To a hotel where he's already looking for you?" His logic was unassailable, but that didn't make it easier to accept. "I can't be involved with organized crime," she said. "I teach art classes to kids on weekends. I volunteer at the animal shelter. I've never even had a speeding ticket." "You're not involved with organized crime," Dante said, closing the distance between them until he was close enough that she could smell his cologne, feel the heat radiating from his body. "You're involved with me, and I'm involved with keeping you alive." His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs stroking across her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. "I didn't choose this world, Catalina. I was born into it. But I've spent my adult life trying to use the resources and connections it gives me to help people who need protecting. People like you." She could see the truth in his dark eyes, the weight of a life spent navigating moral complexities she couldn't begin to understand. But she could also see something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. Desire. Raw and immediate and carefully controlled, but unmistakably there. The air between them seemed to thicken as his gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. She could feel her heart racing, could feel the pull of attraction that had been building since he'd first pulled her against his chest on the subway platform. "Catalina," he said quietly, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a promise and a question all at once. She was going to kiss him, or he was going to kiss her, or they were going to kiss each other, and damn the consequences and the moral complications and the fact that she'd known him less than 24 hours. His phone buzzed with an urgent alert, breaking the spell. Dante stepped back immediately, the loss of his warmth leaving her feeling bereft. "What is it?" she asked, noting the way his expression had shifted to something harder, more dangerous. "Derek's at the Roosevelt station," he said grimly, reading something on his phone. "He's showing your photo to transit workers, asking if anyone's seen you." The reminder of the external threat was like a bucket of cold water, bringing reality crashing back. Derek was still out there, still hunting her, still escalating. Dante made 3 quick phone calls, his voice carrying absolute authority as he coordinated some kind of response. Catalina watched him transform from the gentle man who'd held her face so tenderly into someone who clearly commanded respect and fear in equal measure. When he finished, his attention returned to her completely. "He won't find you," he said with quiet certainty. "My people are making sure of that." "Your people," she repeated. "My family. My business associates. People who understand that Derek Walsh has become a problem that needs to be solved." Something cold settled in her stomach at his tone. "What kind of solution?" "The permanent kind," Dante said simply, and the casual way he said it made her realize exactly how different his world was from hers. But looking at him standing in his expensive kitchen, remembering the way he'd saved her life without hesitation, thinking about Derek's escalating violence and the fear that had become her constant companion, she found herself asking a question that surprised her. "How permanent?" Dante's eyes searched her face, looking for judgment or fear or disgust. Instead, he seemed to find something that made him step closer again. "However permanent it needs to be to keep you safe," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes to make sure he never hurts you or anyone else again." She should be horrified. She should be calling the police or demanding he take her somewhere else or running as far from Dante Castellano as she could get. Instead, she found herself thinking that maybe Derek had finally threatened the wrong person. Maybe he'd pushed her toward exactly the kind of protection she needed, even if it came from a world she'd never imagined being part of. "Okay," she said simply, and watched something shift in Dante's expression. "Okay, I'm staying," she clarified, meeting his intense gaze steadily. "Whatever you are, whatever your family does, you've done nothing but protect me since the moment we met. Derek tried to kill me last night, and the police can't stop him. But you can." Dante moved closer, slowly, giving her time to change her mind. "Understanding what that means, Catalina. Once you're under Castellano protection, you're family. And family loyalty runs both ways." She could feel the weight of that promise, the implications of accepting help from his world. But she could also feel the strength of his presence, the absolute certainty that he would keep her safe no matter what it cost. "I understand," she said, and meant it. This time when he cupped her face in his hands, She didn't pull away. This time when he lowered his head toward hers, she rose up to meet him halfway. The kiss started gentle, a soft brush of lips that tasted like coffee and promises. But when Catalina sighed against his mouth and her hands came up to grip the front of his shirt, something in Dante shifted. His arms tightened around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest as he deepened the kiss with a hunger that made her knees weak. She could feel the careful control he was exercising, the way he held back even as his mouth moved against hers with devastating skill. One hand tangled in her hair, while the other splayed across the small of her back, and she realized dimly that this was what safety felt like. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone strong enough to stand between her and whatever threatened her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against hers. "Mine," he said quietly, the single word carrying more weight than any declaration she'd ever heard. "Yes," she whispered back, because somewhere between the subway platform and this moment, she'd stopped belonging to herself and started belonging to this dangerous man who looked at her like she was something precious. His thumb traced along her bottom lip, and the gentle touch sent fire racing through her bloodstream. "You sure about this, Bella? Because once I claim you properly, there's no going back. You'll be under Castellano protection permanently, and that comes with complications you might not be ready for." The endearment rolled off his tongue like silk, and she found herself leaning into the possessiveness in his voice rather than away from it. "I'm sure," she said, and meant it. "Whatever complications come with your world, they can't be worse than living in fear of Derek." Dante's response was to kiss her again, deeper this time, with less restraint. His hands roamed over her body with reverent appreciation, mapping the curves beneath her sweater like he was memorizing every inch of her. When he lifted her onto the kitchen counter, she wrapped her legs around his waist and pulled him closer, desperate for more contact. They might have lost themselves completely if his phone hadn't rung with the specific tone he'd programmed for emergencies. Dante broke the kiss with a curse in what sounded like Italian, his breathing ragged as he reached for the device. "Marco," he answered, his voice rough with desire and frustration. "This better be important." Whatever Marco said on the other end made Dante's expression go cold and deadly. Catalina watched the transformation, saw the gentle lover disappear beneath the dangerous man who commanded respect and fear in Chicago's underworld. "When?" Dante asked, his free hand still resting possessively on her thigh. "Where is she now?" Catalina's blood turned to ice as she realized they were talking about someone in immediate danger. "Keep her safe," Dante ordered. "I'm on my way." "What happened?" Catalina asked as he hung up. "Derek grabbed your sister," Dante said bluntly, and the world tilted around her. "He cornered her in the parking garage at her college. My people intervened before he could get her into his car, but he made his message clear. He wants you in exchange for her safety. Sophia." Sweet, innocent Sophia, who was supposed to graduate next month, who had never hurt anyone in her life, who was only in danger because Derek was obsessed with Catalina. "I have to go to him," she said immediately, sliding off the counter. "I can't let him hurt her because of me." Dante's hands came up to frame her face, his grip gentle but implacable. "No," he said firmly. "You're not trading yourself to a man who's already tried to kill you once. We handle this the right way." "What's the right way?" she asked, though she was starting to understand that in Dante's world, the right way might not be the legal way. "The way that ensures Derek Walsh never threatens anyone again," Dante said, and there was something final in his tone that made her believe him completely. He made a series of phone calls while she paced his living room, her mind racing with images of Sophia scared and alone, of Derek's hands on her sister, of all the ways this could go wrong. When Dante finished coordinating whatever response he was planning, he turned his full attention back to her. "Sophia is safe," he said. "She's with Marco at a secure location. Derek doesn't have her." "How can you be sure?" "Because Marco Torino is the best at what he does, and what he does is keep people safe. He's been my second since we were teenagers, and he's never failed a protection assignment." The confidence in Dante's voice was reassuring, but Catalina couldn't shake the image of her sister in danger because of Derek's obsession. "This is my fault," she said. "If I hadn't left Derek, if I'd handled things differently." Dante crossed to her in 2 quick strides, his hands gripping her shoulders firmly. "Listen to me," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. Derek Walsh chose to be a predator. Derek Walsh chose to escalate to violence. Derek Walsh chose to threaten an innocent woman to get to you. None of that is your fault, Catalina. You didn't create this situation, and you're not responsible for his choices. The certainty in his voice broke through the guilt that had been building in her chest. He was right, she realized. She'd spent so long accepting responsibility for Derek's behavior that she'd forgotten he was the one making the choice to hurt people. What happens now? She asked. Now we go collect your sister, and then we introduce you to my family, Dante said. And then we end this permanently. An hour later, Catalina found herself in the back of Dante's Mercedes, speeding toward a restaurant in Little Italy while he explained the plan. Sofia was being brought to Nana's, the family restaurant that served as unofficial headquarters for Castellano business discussions. They'll want to meet you, he warned as they pulled up to a modest storefront with old-world charm. My mother especially. She's been wondering why I've been distracted the past few days. You've been distracted? Catalina asked, surprised by the admission. Dante's hand found hers, fingers interlacing with casual possessiveness. Ever since I pulled you off those subway tracks, I haven't been able to think about anything else. That's not normal for me, Bella. The restaurant was warm and welcoming, filled with the scent of garlic and herbs and the sound of animated conversation in multiple languages. But Catalina only had eyes for Sofia, who jumped up from a corner booth and rushed to embrace her. Cat, oh my God, I was so scared. This guy Derek said he was your boyfriend and he knew things about you, about where you worked, about me. When I said you hadn't mentioned dating anyone, he got angry and grabbed my arm. Sofia was talking fast, the way she always did when she was nervous, and Catalina held her tighter than necessary, relief flooding through her at the confirmation that her sister was safe. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry he dragged you into this. This is Marco, Sofia continued, gesturing to a dark-haired man in his early 30s who'd been sitting across from her. He literally appeared out of nowhere when Derek grabbed me, like some kind of ninja bodyguard. Marco Torino was younger than Dante, but carried himself with the same confident authority, the same watchful awareness that suggested he was always ready for trouble. When he shook Catalina's hand, his grip was firm and his eyes were kind, but she could see the steel underneath. Sophia's safe, he said simply. Derek won't get within 100 yards of her again. Before Catalina could ask what that meant, an older woman emerged from the kitchen area, elegant despite her simple dress and apron, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of bone structure that suggested she'd been beautiful her entire life. Dante, Caro, she said, embracing him warmly before turning expectant eyes on Catalina. And you must be the woman who's had my son walking into walls for 3 days. Mama, this is Catalina Reyes, Dante said, and Catalina was surprised by the hint of nervousness in his voice. Catalina, my mother, Isabella Castellano. Mrs. Castellano studied her with dark eyes that were remarkably similar to Dante's, taking in everything from her appearance to her posture to the way she stayed close to Sofia. Sit, she said finally, gesturing to a large table in the back corner. You look like you haven't eaten properly in days. What followed was a meal unlike anything Catalina had ever experienced. Dishes appeared without being ordered, each more delicious than the last, while Isabella Castellano held court like the matriarch she clearly was. Sofia relaxed under the older woman's motherly attention, chattering about her classes and her upcoming graduation, while Marco and several other serious-looking men came and went, speaking quietly with Dante in what sounded like code. You're good for him, Isabella said suddenly, leaning close to Catalina while Dante was distracted by a phone call. I haven't seen him smile this much in years. We've only known each other for 3 days, Catalina protested, but Isabella waved that away. Time doesn't matter when it's right, she said with absolute certainty. His father knew he wanted to marry me after our second conversation. Some things are just meant to be. The casual mention of marriage made Catalina's heart skip, but before she could respond, Dante returned to the table with an expression that suggested the phone call had been significant. It's handled, he said simply, and something in his tone made several conversations around them go quiet. What's handled? Catalina asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Derek Walsh won't be bothering you anymore, Dante said, reaching for her hand across the table. Ever. The finality in his voice made her stomach clench, but before she could ask for details, Isabella was standing and announcing that she had cannoli in the kitchen that needed to be eaten. As the evening wound down and Sophia dozed against Marco's shoulder like she'd known him for years instead of hours, Catalina found herself alone with Dante on the restaurant's small balcony, the lights of Chicago spreading out below them. "What exactly does handled mean?" she asked quietly. "It means Derek Walsh is no longer in Chicago," Dante said, his arm tightening around her waist. "It means he understands that coming back would be extremely bad for his health. It means you and Sophia are safe." "You didn't kill him," she said, surprised by the relief in her voice. "No, though I wanted to," Dante admitted. "But he's been made to understand that his obsession with you ends now, permanently, and that any attempt to contact you or Sophia will have permanent consequences." "How can you be sure he'll stay away?" she asked, because Derek had never responded well to threats or boundaries. "Because men like Derek are fundamentally cowards, and cowards understand the language of superior force. He's seen what I'm capable of, and he knows that I have resources he can't match and connections he can't fight." Catalina leaned back against Dante's chest, feeling safer than she had in months. The fear that had been her constant companion was finally beginning to recede, replaced by something warmer and more hopeful. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could think better of them. Dante went very still behind her, and for a moment she wondered if she'd made a mistake. If 3 days was too soon for declarations like that, even when those 3 days had contained more intensity than some people experienced in years. Then he was turning her in his arms, his hands framing her face as he looked down at her with an expression that took her breath away. "Ti amo anch'io," he said quietly, and even though she didn't speak Italian, the meaning was clear in his voice, his eyes, the reverent way he touched her. "I love you too, Catalina. More than I thought possible." When he kissed her this time, it tasted like promises and pasta sauce and forever. Like coming home to a place she'd never known she was looking for. "Mine," he whispered against her lips. "Yours," she whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The call came at 6 in the morning, 2 weeks after Derek had supposedly been handled permanently. Catalina awoke to Dante's phone buzzing with urgent insistence, his body going rigid beside her as he read whatever message had arrived. "What is it?" she asked, though the cold dread settling in her stomach already knew. "Derek has Sophia," Dante said grimly, already reaching for clothes. "He grabbed her from the coffee shop near campus an hour ago." Catalina's blood turned to ice. "But Marco was watching her. You said she was protected." "She was," Dante said, pulling on jeans with efficient movements. "Derek used a decoy, drew Marco's attention with a fake emergency while someone else took Sophia. It was planned, coordinated. He's had help." The room tilted around her as the implications hit. Derek hadn't given up. He'd been planning, waiting, finding ways around Dante's protection. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and she knew without looking that it was Derek. "Navy Pier, Warehouse 47, midnight. Come alone or your sister dies. No boyfriend, no bodyguards, no family. Just you." Attached was a photo of Sophia tied to a chair in what looked like an abandoned building. Fear stark in her young face, but defiance still blazing in her eyes. Even terrified, Sophia looked like she was planning to fight. "I'm going," Catalina said immediately, already reaching for clothes. "No," Dante said firmly, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You're not walking into an obvious trap." "He has my sister," she said, turning to face him with steel in her voice that surprised them both. "My baby sister who's only in danger because Derek is obsessed with me. I won't let him hurt her because I'm hiding behind your protection." Dante's expression shifted as he recognized something new in her voice, something harder than the frightened woman he'd pulled from the subway tracks 2 weeks ago. "You think I'm just going to let you sacrifice yourself?" he asked, moving closer with predatory grace. "I think you're going to help me save her," Catalina said, meeting his intense gaze steadily. "But I'm going to that warehouse, Dante. With or without you." Something flashed in his dark eyes, approval mixed with frustration and fierce protectiveness. "With me," he said finally. "But we do this my way. Derek wants you to come alone, but that doesn't mean you actually have to be alone." The plan Dante outlined over breakfast was intricate and dangerous. involving positioning his people throughout the warehouse district hours before the meeting. Marco would handle perimeter security, other associates would cover potential escape routes, and Dante himself would shadow Catalina at a distance, close enough to intervene, but far enough away that Derek wouldn't spot him immediately. "You sure about this, Bella?" Dante asked as they prepared to leave. Derek's desperate now, and desperate men do unpredictable things. "I'm sure," she said, checking the small communication device Marco had given her one final time. "Sophia is the only family I have left. I won't lose her because I was too afraid to fight." Dante cupped her face in his hands, thumbs stroking across her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I'm going to ask you to marry me. I want you to know that before we walk into this." The admission hit her like lightning, hope and fear and love tangling in her chest. "When this is over," she replied, "the answer is yes." Navy Pier at midnight was a maze of shadows and abandoned buildings, the warehouse district stretching along the lake like a collection of sleeping giants. Warehouse 47 sat at the end of a dead-end street, its windows dark and broken, the kind of place where screams would go unheard. Catalina approached on foot as instructed, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her stride steady. She could feel Dante somewhere behind her in the darkness, could sense the presence of his people positioned throughout the area like protective spirits. The warehouse door stood partially open, spilling weak light into the night. She pushed through into a vast space filled with abandoned machinery and the smell of rust and decay. Sophia sat in the center of the open floor, tied to a metal chair, but alert and unharmed. Relief flooded through Catalina at the sight of her sister alive and defiant. "Very good," Derek's voice echoed from the shadows near the back wall. "You came alone just like I knew you would. Always the protective big sister." He stepped into the light, and Catalina was shocked by his appearance. The polished Derek she'd known was gone, replaced by someone gaunt and wildeed, his expensive clothes wrinkled and dirty, his hands shaking with what might have been withdrawal or desperation or both. "Let her go," Catalina said, staying calm despite the fear clawing at her throat. "You have what you want. I'm here." "What I want," Derek said, moving closer with jerky, unpredictable movements, "is for you to remember who you belong to. What I want is for you to stop this ridiculous fantasy about being independent and come home where you belong." "I don't belong to you," she said firmly, and something in her tone made his face twist with rage. "Wrong answer," he snarled, pulling a gun from his jacket with hands that shook badly enough to make him even more dangerous. The sight of the weapon sent ice through her veins, but also something else. Anger. Pure, clean fury at this man who'd terrorized her for months, who'd tried to kill her, who'd now dragged her innocent sister into his twisted obsession. "You're pathetic," she said, her voice carrying more strength than she'd known she possessed. "Look at you. This is what you've become because you can't accept that I don't want you." Derek's face went white with rage, the gun swinging toward Sophia. "Maybe I should start with her," he said. "Maybe watching your sister die will remind you what happens when you defy me." That's when Catalina moved, not toward Derek, but toward the small communication device in her pocket, pressing the button that would signal Dante that the situation had escalated beyond words. The warehouse exploded into motion. Doors she hadn't noticed burst open as armed figures poured in from multiple directions, moving with military precision. Derek spun wildly, trying to track threats from every angle, his gun wavering between Catalina and Sophia. "You brought them," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You lying bitch, you brought them." "I brought my family," Catalina said calmly, backing towards Sophia, while Dante's people surrounded Derek with professional efficiency. Dante himself appeared from the shadows like an avenging angel, moving with deadly grace that made Derek's desperate flailing look like amateur theater. His presence dominated the space, radiating controlled violence and absolute authority. "Derek Walsh," he said conversationally, as if they were meeting at a coffee shop instead of an abandoned warehouse. "You were warned to stay away from what's mine." "She's not yours," Derek shrieked, swinging the gun toward Dante. "She's mine. She's always been mine." "Wrong again," Dante said, and his voice carried death in it. Derek pulled the trigger, but his hands were shaking too badly for accuracy. The shot went wide, sparking off machinery while Dante moved forward with inhuman speed. What happened next was over in seconds. Dante disarmed Derek with brutal efficiency, the gun clattering across the concrete floor while Derek crumpled to his knees, cradling what was obviously a broken wrist. Marco was already cutting Sophia free, checking her for injuries with gentle competence while other associates secured the perimeter. "Is it over?" Sophia asked shakily, rubbing her wrists where the ropes had chafed. "It's over," Dante said with finality, standing over Derek's writhing form. "Completely over." "What happens to him?" Catalina asked, surprised to find she didn't really care as long as he could never hurt anyone again. "Derek Walsh disappears," Dante said simply. "Permanently. There won't be a body to find or a missing person report to file. He'll just stop existing, which is what should have happened months ago." Looking down at the broken man who'd terrorized her for so long, Catalina felt something shift inside her chest. Not satisfaction, exactly, but a kind of closure she'd never expected to feel. "Good," she said quietly, and meant it. An hour later, sitting in the back of Dante's Mercedes with Sophia's head on her shoulder and the warehouse burning in their rearview mirror, Catalina finally felt the last of her fear drain away. Derek was gone, really gone this time, and she was safe. Sophia was safe. They were all safe. About that proposal, Dante said from the front seat, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Ask me tomorrow," she said, stroking Sophia's hair as her sister dozed against her shoulder. "When we're home, and this is really over." "Home," Dante repeated, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "I like the sound of that, Mrs. Castellano." The presumption should have bothered her, but instead it made her smile. She was going to be Mrs. Castellano, was going to be part of his dangerous, loving, fiercely protective family. She was going to be his, and he was going to be hers, and no one would ever threaten that again. 6 months later, Catalina stood before the mirror in the bridal suite at the Palmer House Hilton, adjusting the delicate lace of her wedding dress while Sophia fussed with her veil. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened graphic designer who'd been pushed onto subway tracks half a year ago. This Catalina had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes, the confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. She'd kept her business, growing it to include several high-profile clients who appreciated her discretion as much as her artistic eye. Some of those clients had connections to Dante's world, but she'd learned to navigate those waters with the same grace she brought to everything else. "You look beautiful, Cat," Sophia said, tears threatening to ruin her carefully applied makeup. "I can't believe my sister is marrying into the most powerful family in Chicago." "I'm marrying the man I love," Catalina corrected gently, though she understood Sophia's amazement. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of integration into the Castellano world, learning the unspoken rules and careful politics that governed Dante's life. Isabella had taken her under her wing like the mother Catalina had lost too young, teaching her which questions to ask and which to leave unasked, which social events were business and which were purely personal. Marco had become like a brother, protective and loyal, and surprisingly funny when he wasn't in bodyguard mode. The door opened to admit Isabella herself, elegant in navy blue silk, carrying a small velvet box. "Something old from the family collection," she said, opening the box to reveal a stunning sapphire necklace. It belonged to Dante's grandmother, and her grandmother before that. Castellano brides have worn it for 4 generations. The weight of tradition and acceptance settled around Catalina's throat along with the necklace. She was becoming part of something larger than herself, a family that protected its own with ruthless efficiency and loved with equal intensity. The ceremony itself took place at St. Alphonsus, the same church where Dante's parents had married 35 years ago. The guest list was an interesting blend of legitimate Chicago society and figures whose names never appeared in newspapers, but whose presence shaped the city's power structure. Catalina's small collection of friends and remaining relatives looked slightly overwhelmed by the display of wealth and influence, but Sophia had charmed half the groomsmen and was deep in conversation with several Castellano cousins about her graduate school plans. When the doors opened and the wedding march began, Catalina walked down the aisle alone. She'd considered asking Marco to give her away, but ultimately decided that she was giving herself to Dante freely, as an equal partner rather than property transferred between men. Dante waited at the altar in a black tuxedo that emphasized his dark beauty, his expression transforming when he saw her approaching. The dangerous man who commanded fear and respect throughout Chicago's underworld looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered. "Dearly beloved," Father Martinez began, but Catalina barely heard the traditional words. She was lost in Dante's eyes, in the promises they'd already made to each other in private, in the certainty that this was exactly where she belonged. The vows they'd written themselves were simple, but loaded with meaning that only they fully understood. "I promise to stand with you," Dante said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "in whatever world we build together. I promise to protect what we have and to trust you with who I am, completely and without reservation." "I promise to choose you," Catalina replied, her own voice steady and sure, "every day, whatever that choice requires. I promise to be your partner in all things, your equal in our home, and your refuge when the world demands too much." When Father Martinez pronounced them married, Dante's kiss was gentle but possessive, a claiming that spoke of forever and belonging and the kind of love that could survive anything the world threw at them. The reception at Nana's restaurant had been transformed into something magical, every table laden with Isabella's finest dishes and the best wine from the family's private collection. Catalina found herself accepting congratulations from federal judges and crime bosses with equal grace, her new world expanding to encompass complexities she was still learning to navigate. During the father-daughter dance, Marco stepped in to waltz her around the floor, while Dante spoke quietly with several men whose presence suggested business was never entirely separate from personal celebration. "You did good, kid," Marco said as he spun her gracefully between tables. "He's been different since he met you. Happier, more settled." "Different how?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Less angry," Marco said simply. "Dante's carried a lot of weight since his father died, a lot of responsibility for keeping the family safe and strong. But with you, he remembers how to just be a man in love instead of a leader making life-and-death decisions." The observation stayed with her through the evening, through the endless toasts and traditional dances and warm embraces from people who were now her family. When they finally escaped to Dante's car, her feet aching and her face sore from smiling, she felt the deep satisfaction of a day that had been perfect in every way that mattered. Their honeymoon in Sicily was everything she'd dreamed and more. 2 weeks of exploring Dante's ancestral homeland and learning about the roots that had shaped him. They visited the village where his great-grandfather had been born, toured vineyards that had been in his family for generations, spent lazy afternoons in bed while Mediterranean sun streamed through ancient shutters. But it was the quiet moments that mattered most, the conversations about their future and the children they wanted and the legacy they hoped to build together. Away from Chicago's pressures and expectations, they were simply Catalina and Dante, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds. 1 year later, Catalina stood in the same Roosevelt Red Line station where her old life had ended and her new one had begun, this time waiting for Sophia to emerge from the train. Her sister was finishing her master's degree at Northwestern, specializing in social work with a focus on domestic violence prevention. The platform looked exactly the same, but everything about Catalina's relationship to this space had transformed. Where once she'd felt trapped and vulnerable, now she felt connected to the city above and the life she'd built in it. Her graphic design business was thriving. Her marriage was everything she'd never dared to hope for, and the slight swell of her belly promised new joy in the months ahead. Dante's hand found her back as he joined her near the tracks, his presence as comforting now as it had been life-saving that first night. "Nervous about telling her?" he asked quietly, noting her protective gesture over the small bump that wouldn't be obvious to anyone who wasn't looking for it. "Excited," she corrected, leaning into his familiar warmth. "Sophia's going to be the best aunt in Chicago. She'll spoil him rotten," Dante agreed, his own hand covering hers over their growing child. "Him?" Catalina asked with raised eyebrows. "Or her?" he said quickly, but his grin suggested he'd already started planning baseball games and protective hovering. The train pulled in with its familiar screech and rumble, passengers flowing out in the eternal rhythm of urban life. Sophia appeared in the crowd, older and more confident than the college student who'd once needed rescuing, her face lighting up when she spotted them. As she approached with the quick stride of someone who belonged in this city, Catalina reflected on the strange turns life could take. A year ago, she'd been a woman running from violence, isolated and afraid. Now she was a Castellano wife, a successful businesswoman, and soon to be a mother, surrounded by a family that would move heaven and earth to protect what was theirs. The platform where Derek had tried to destroy her had become the foundation for everything beautiful in her new life. Sometimes the worst moments led to the most unexpected blessings, delivered by the hands of strangers who became everything you'd never known you needed. Before I let you go tonight, I have to ask something that's been on my mind since this whole story began. Have you ever had someone unexpected come into your life at exactly the moment you needed them most? Maybe it wasn't a mafia boss on a subway platform, but someone who showed up when everything felt hopeless and changed your whole world? Drop a comment and tell me about your own experience with unexpected protection or life-changing encounters. Sometimes our guardian angels come in forms we never would have imagined. Sophia reached them with a breathless laugh and fierce hugs, immediately launching into stories about her internship and her thesis and the professor who'd offered her a research position for the following year. But as they walked toward the exit together, Dante's arm around Catalina's waist and Sophia chattering happily beside them, Catalina found herself thinking about the beautiful unpredictability of love and rescue and finding your place in the world. She'd come to this platform a year ago as Catalina Reyes, alone and afraid. She was leaving it now as Catalina Castellano, protected and cherished, and carrying the next generation of a family that had claimed her completely. The woman who'd once lived in fear of unexpected footsteps now walked confidently through Chicago's night, knowing that the most dangerous man in the city would always be watching her back, that her sister was building a career helping other women escape the kind of terror she'd once faced, and that the life growing inside her would know only safety and love and the unshakable security of belonging somewhere completely. Sometimes, she thought as they emerged into the busy street above, being pushed toward the tracks was really just being pushed toward exactly where you were meant to land.